Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Emily, thank you so much for coming on and being my guest today.
Alison, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be
Yeah,
here.
so we're doing an episode on rental trends, and you are Zillow's rental trends expert. And I'm just going to give everyone a little bit of a background, kind of how this whole episode happened. So Emily actually reached out to me, and she heard of this amazing podcast and had listened to it and wanted to she broached me about doing an episode about really just rental trends in general, which I thought was really great because we have done very nuanced episodes about rental things. We talked about how to foster a dog when you live in a rental, and we've really compared renting to owning a lot. But this is like a really full picture about rental trends, the market. And actually, Emily, you just pulled stats from they just came out a couple of days ago, right?
Yeah. Just yesterday, Zillow released our March rental market report. And I think a really good place to start is to kind of zoom out, learn what's happening right at this moment, especially as we are gearing up for rental season, which is typically the spring and summer months. So our March data found that rents are in fact rising once again. I know I feel like we heard about this all last year, even in some parts of 2021, that the post-pandemic dip, rents started rising again. Last winter, rents did start to fall, decline, slow a bit in much of the country, but now things are ticking back up. As of March, rents nationwide are just under $2,000 a month. That's the typical rent payment. And that's about 6% higher than it was just a year ago. So we're getting up there again in terms of rent. And in DC specifically, it's important to call out DC was actually one of the five fastest growing metro areas as far as rent growth over the past month. So compared to February and March, rents grew almost 1% in DC, which is quite a lot.
Yeah.
And it shows that, the spring season is kicking into gear. Rent demand is high again, and we expect it to be a competitive season.
Yeah, I mean, and this is all important to know right now. And I think as we go through, this is going to go live in a couple of days. And of course, you guys have your reports that come out every month. So even though some of this data will continue to change, definitely will continue to change. People can, of course, use you as a resource to kind of understand more data as it comes along. But before we really get into it, I just need to also tell everybody what was really funny when you contacted me is we set up our initial phone call, everyone, to talk. And she called me and her area code is from my hometown. And so I answered the phone and I didn't even say anything. I was like, hey, where are you from? And she said, I'm from upstate New York. And we started talking about where. And she told me where. I was like, oh man, I'm from Latham. And she's told me what a high school she went to. And guys, we went to the same high school.
So bizarre. That was really crazy and very unexpected.
Very unexpected. Yes. I mean, I am quite a bit older than you, so we probably did not have any of the same teachers. But anyway, I thought that was very cool. Okay, so let's get into it. So with everybody understanding that this information is going to change as we go along, but I think the trends are what's really important, the way things are trending right now. And they're almost, I'm knocking on wood, but things are definitely not going to make some huge kind of switch because, I think we've already seen the massive kind of switches in the market right now and that things are hopefully going to even out a little bit. But yeah, so why don't you start with this kind of high level, like national stuff, and then we'll bring it into DC. And you're going to know a lot more about everything outside of DC because obviously I don't track that. But I think it gives context to where we're at here.
Totally. Yeah. So want to kind of zoom out and start with the what's going on for renters nationwide right now and the quote unquote good news, which I know I just started off with rents are rising again, but why that is somewhat good news is because things are calming down from what we were seeing in the past 2 years. So the new data shows us that the rent growth we're seeing is driven mostly by seasonal trends. So what we're seeing is that 2023 is shaping up to be somewhat of a quote unquote normal year, which we haven't really seen since, before the pandemic started in 2020. So the rent growth we're seeing is pretty normal, which is the not so maybe sort of good news for renters right now. And I think it's going to be a really competitive season. But the other piece of good news is there are a ton of apartment buildings opening up this year.
Mm-hmm.
And DC in particular is one of those metro areas I'm sure you've noticed, and everybody that lives there has noticed a ton of construction happening. And this new apartment inventory opening up theoretically means it should help rental affordability. So while rents probably won't decline anytime soon, it'll help keep things rising at a normal pace.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to throw something in there because I was helping somebody recently look for rentals. He's moving from Baltimore, so he's coming from a city that costs a lot less and coming to DC, and the building he's in currently in Baltimore has a high amenity building. So we were trying to see kind of what is out there. And I know we're going to get into later about things that developers are doing to attract renters. But I will say that what's being built now is very high end. So affordability for rental units is still pretty tough here because while they are building a lot, developers have had an increase in cost to build. And so I think to recoup that, the rent prices are getting pretty high. You know, you've got like a 520 square foot, 1 bedroom. I'm putting it in quotes because it's one of those like interior bedrooms, you know, with sliding doors. You know, that's starting off at like 2,500 without all of the different fees and stuff that you have tacked on. So, you know, there's that. So, I mean, you may have a wider choice, but if your budget is very limited, it's going to be challenging.
Of course. Yeah. It's definitely a really good point to bring up. And I think we talk a lot about this at Zillow. It used to be about location, location, location. Now it's affordability, 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 especially, you know, after the pandemic and during the pandemic, the cost of home ownership shot through the roof. Mm-hmm. So people are continuing to rent, which drives rent demand up and drives rent prices up. So that is where really the huge run up in rent prices started and came from.
Yeah. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so sorry, I interrupted you to comment on the stock, basically the housing stock going up, and me saying, well, you know, kind of, but okay,
no, that's okay. I think just, you know, kicking into the competitive spring and summer season, I definitely want to talk through some strategies and tips and tricks for renters that they can use at this time of year. I know in DC in particular, it's going to be new grad season. There's going to be a ton of new renters entering the scene. You know, the spring and summer months when it's warmer is when people want to move. So it is when we see a bunch of new inventory open up. It's also when prices start to rise. Mm-hmm. So there are things that renters can do even in this competitive season. And Zillow recently surveyed renters who found success over the past 2 years to actually end up signing their lease. So there were 5 key takeaways that we found through our survey. And some of them might work for you, some of them might not. Just take what you like out of these 5 tips and apply what works for you if you are looking to sign a new lease this year as prices continue to rise and demand continues to rise. So the first being flexible on move-in date. I think this is a big one. You know, landlords don't want their units to sit empty any longer than they possibly have to. So you need to be flexible with when you can start your lease. You know, your lease sign date is going to be. So if that means couch surfing for 2 weeks so that you can move into your apartment on April 15th as opposed to April 1st, or possibly even having to pay that double rent scenario for 2 weeks if it works better for your landlord, it is a way that you can be more competitive in this time. And then the second piece, being willing to pay more upfront. And this might sound a little bit obvious to some because, of course, this might be an appealing fact to landlords if you're like, okay, I'm going to pay 2 months rent upfront. But I know, Alison, you and I were talking, and that doesn't actually seem to be a strategy that might work for DC renters. Mm-hmm. But because I know you had a comment on that.
Well, I was just saying that, you know, I've helped a decent number of people find find rentals. You know, there are a lot of agents in this area who just kind of stop working with renters, but, you know, I still do fair a number of them. And when I am trying to help people and advising them on what to do, the more money up front tends to not be as big of a push here for landlords, because ultimately what it comes down to is everybody wants consistent payment to make sure that people are going to pay every single month. So just because I may have socked away a lot of money and can give you 3 months up front doesn't necessarily mean that it's it's really speaking to what those last 9 months would be like. So I think it's something to offer if you're in a
Mhm.
competitive situation, but I don't think that's normally what pushes the dial so much here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's totally fair. And I think the consistent rent payments kind of leans into this next point, which is about having strong references. And I know every rental I've ever applied to, I've been a lifetime renter, but one of those pieces is, a note from your past landlord to make sure that you're a consistent rent payer. And a question that we often get actually at Zillow is, what if this is my first rental? What if I don't have a landlord to give me a reference letter? And I think even yourself writing a cover letter to that landlord, or using, your manager from work, somebody to show how you are consistently showing up for work, consistently, putting in what you need to do, can show that you are a reliable renter. And while it's not ideal, it's something to offer if you have, no prior renting
Yeah,
experience.
I definitely agree with that one. I mean, it's kind of like when you put in an application like on LinkedIn and you apply to a job and you have your resume already there, but there's no context, right? There's no cover letter, there's no explanation as to why you want that job. Like sure, you might have the minimum qualifications, but what's your story? A cover letter can really help. And something that I don't think you're going to touch on, and if you are, I'm sorry if I'm saying it ahead of you, but you can have a cosigner. A
Mhm.
lot of people feel more comfortable if, like I feel like you're really talking to, say, college graduates. People are starting their first job, they want to rent a place, they don't have a huge rental history. I don't know. They're not going to have like their RA at college, right? I mean, I don't know. Maybe they would, but that would actually probably be a good reference. But like they're not going to have like real life in the world rental experience, and so
Mhm.
having a cosigner could help. I don't know. I had to do it once. It was kind of embarrassing, I guess, because I was like, no, I'm 22 or whatever I was, and I can do this and I have a job. But the fact is, if you're in a competitive situation, that might push you to be able to get that rental. And ultimately, if you are good at paying the rent, then whoever's co-signed for you isn't going to have to do anything. Their name's just on the
Totally.
lease.
Yes, totally. And I think in metro areas like DC and New York, where I live, it is so normal.
Mm-hmm.
For my first two apartments, had to sign with a
Mm-hmm.
guarantor. It's a very normal process. And as long as your landlord is willing to accept it, and I think that's a question worth asking up front if you think it applies to you, it's a great option.
I mean, money is money, right? So, I
Yeah.
mean, as a landlord, I'm a landlord. As long as I'm predictably going to get money on the first of the month, because that's what's in my lease, then I kind of don't care who's paying it. I just wanted to come in
Mhm.
so that my mortgage gets paid and bada bing, bada boom, like we're all good.
Exactly, exactly. And then the final two tips, two strategies for renters that definitely have proven to work: be one of the first applicants and offer to sign a longer lease. Again, two that might sound obvious to you, but being one of the first applicants is really just about speed and making sure you're checking listings, applying to apartments that you like as soon as you see them, and then offering to sign a longer lease. I think this is a win-win. One, for the landlord, if they know they have the guarantee for a renter to be filling their unit for 2 years as opposed to 1 year, that's a win for them. And also, if you're signing a 2-year lease, you know that you're set in stone for that price you're going to be paying for 2 years as opposed to one. And then, the landlord reevaluates your lease and could up your rent. So I think that one is a win-win for both parties.
Yeah, well, and they're also reevaluating the market, right? To the point of the fact that you have these things coming out every month telling us about that. If a landlord's paying attention, then every year they might say, well, they've statistically gone up X%, so I'm going to apply that to my place as well. I do want to go back and comment on the be the first one, applicant. This
Mm-hmm.
one's really, really important. It's the same for buying houses as far as I'm concerned. I've met a lot of people who say that they really want to either buy or rent, but then they want to wait a day or two to check out a place or to apply or whatever the case may be. It's really, really not advisable to do that. And there have been some recent changes in, DC kind of law and how you should go ahead with dealing with rental applications. And it's really discouraged to hold applications and to review them all at
Mm-hmm.
once. It starts to go against fair housing potentially, and we're going to get to fair housing stuff in a bit. But so the fact of the matter is, if somebody gets a full application in, then it should be run immediately. And so that's why being in there first is of the utmost importance. So
Right.
just wanted to say that out loud for anybody who is in this market of the DC, Maryland, Virginia market, that if this is something you're committed to renting, then you should be ready to jump.
Yes. Yeah. Especially in this competitive market. It's like have your documents ready to go and apply as soon as you can.
Yep.
And then the final thing I'll say is just make sure that you're using tech to your advantage. There's so much available now as opposed to even when I started renting 10 years ago. What is available to you in terms of data, in terms of, imagery? You could literally get such a great sense of an apartment before even going to visit it in person by what's available online. On Zillow, you can see 3D home tours. You can see exactly where in the building an apartment is located now with 3D maps. It's really crazy how much it has evolved. And it can help you with that speed aspect too. You can apply sight unseen pretty comfortably for a lot of apartments now, as long as you're comfortable with that. I definitely haven't ever signed for an apartment sight unseen, but during the pandemic, it was a trend that I really don't think is going to go away.
Well, and there are people, especially in this area, who are coming back to DC from living abroad. You've got State Department and stuff like that. So people who need to find a place and they don't have the option to come themselves, and maybe they don't have an option to send a friend or family member either. I will say, again, in the context of how applications are working here in this area, an agent or a homeowner who's renting their own place can say, listen, you need to actually come and see the space before you apply to avoid any kind of issues of somebody applying, then asking if they can see it, or trying to get out of the lease or whatever the case may be. So that's understandable, right? But that just has to be consistent amongst all of the people who apply. So
yeah.
But if that's not a prereq, then you can apply sight unseen pretty easily right now with all of the different tours and things that exist, for sure.
Yeah. And I think it leads into our next topic we want to touch on pretty well, because as you said, homeowners for single family homes that are the smaller landlords definitely might prefer you come in person. But some of these larger rental management companies, I think, even prefer, sight unseen, like let's move renters. So I do want to talk about this, especially when it comes to the DC area, just the many different types of rentals available to people out there. I think when I started renting, I had no idea. I just thought, okay, here's a rental. I didn't realize there were condos, co-ops, single family homes, rental management companies. And I think it's a really piece of important information that renters should research before they, make their decision. So I think, and I want you to tell me, being in New York, I feel the makeup of rentals is pretty similar in the DC area, where it's a lot of apartments and there are a lot of these big rental management companies. Is that right?
Yeah. There are a lot of apartment buildings. They're usually pretty obvious. They've got like a sales center or a rental whatever center, the ones with the signs that say come in or whatever that the case may be. But you have a ton of homeowners who are renting their places out, kind of to an earlier point where I said you've got a lot of transient people coming here. A lot of people will buy a home and then use it as a rental, either in between when they're going and coming back, or just after they've upgraded, or after they've just moved abroad, whatever the case may be. So you do have, and then you mentioned co-ops. Some people do own co-ops and rent them out. It's a little bit tougher because the rules, New York's got a ton of co-ops, like the large number of co-ops in the United States, because I did an episode on co-ops like 3 months ago. But DC, I think, is number 2. And the restrictions with co-ops are a bit different than in condos. So I think that's probably the least common kind of rental people will find, but yeah.
And I will say, as a renter, I think it's an important piece of information to look into as you are touring, as you're looking to sign a lease. I rented a co-op and didn't know it until I was already in the building. I didn't really realize the ins and outs of co-ops and the rules that and the things you need to go to make the smallest changes, even as a renter, are complex. And I think there's trade-offs and pros and cons to each type of building and type of rental unit. I was just looking on Zillow before hopping on this call at the types of inventory available in DC right now. And there are a ton of apartments available right now, which is good news. And I think these big apartment buildings, one of the definite pros to living there is the ease of getting in. You know, they have the leasing office, as you said, like there's always somebody there
Mm-hmm.
to give you a tour and to talk to you about renting. And then also a piece of that, it often comes with some of those great amenities
Mm-hmm.
that we know and love, like having a doorman, having a gym, those luxury type amenities. But then there are definitely pros to looking at the single family homes or smaller multifamily buildings. I live in a building right now that has 8 units. I live on the first floor, and I have a personal relationship with my landlord, which I think is a definite pro for living in this type of building.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have an elevator, I don't have a doorman or any of that stuff, but the personal relationship with my landlord means that when it comes time to re-sign my lease, I can talk to her, you know, about what's going on, my situation, her situation. And last year, when rents were rising so much, my rent didn't go up at all. So,
Yeah.
and I can't say the same for my friends that live in some of the bigger rental
Yeah, I
buildings.
mean, I will say apartment buildings, if we have to like really kind of high level summarize them, it's more like churn and burn, right? There used to be people
Mm-hmm.
going in and out, and because of that, the fees usually are a little bit lower actually. The security deposit might be say $500 or $1,000 if your rent's, you know, say over 2,000. Whereas almost definitely in DC, if you're renting someone's personal residence, I have yet to see somebody not take a full 1 month security deposit. So that plays into money, right, and all that. But you know, if you're living in someone's personal unit that they own versus a building with tons of units owned by more of like a corporation or, you know, business, I think the person who owns the individual unit is trying to protect that unit, right? It's their investment. It's something
Mm-hmm.
they're maybe trying to hold on to help them with their retirement down the road. So I mean, the fact is, it's just a different kind of feel, but the money is different there too, because we were talking about like costs and stuff like that before. So that's something to consider. I did
Yeah.
also want to say there are people, a lot of people here who use a property management company, an existing company, to rent their unit out. But then the question
Mm-hmm.
is, who's managing that unit? And sometimes it's the company who helped rent it out, and sometimes it's the owner. So you
Mm-hmm.
might be duped in thinking, well, it's a condo that this person owns in this building, but the property management company is showing me and they're going to be the ones who are coordinating, and that's necessarily the case. So to your overarching point, make sure you're understanding from top to bottom who is involved and you're going to be involved with throughout the duration of your whole lease.
Right. Yes. Am I talking to the owner of my unit? Am I
Mm-hmm.
talking to the person that helps them manage all their properties, the property manager? Is it a leasing office? Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree. And I think just getting into this point of apartment buildings too leads us into a point that I also wanted to make about how things have changed since the pandemic and the trends that have emerged as developers are, you know, adjusting to what people are looking for now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the major points that I I love this stat is that the age of a first time home buyer is now 37 years old, as opposed to before the pandemic, it was 33 or 34. So people are renting for longer and their needs are changing. So I think developers are taking notice of this and the amenities that we're seeing in some of these buildings in DC in particular. I was also recently talking to a reporter about different amenities that are popping up in DC, but things are changing. And I think people are paying attention more to community now, holistic wellness, amenities for their children, their pets. There's new things popping up that I hadn't seen in New York. So definitely wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean the pets thing is huge. I mean DC has become such a pet. I mean DC, Maryland, Virginia, but DC in particular because it's like you know the most metropolitan area here has gotten so big with dogs. And I mean obviously anybody who listens to this knows I'm like obsessed with dogs. Fine, I was like that before the pandemic, but you know it's really important in a city to make sure you have amenities for dogs in particular because they need to go out. So you know people they put like runs, you know like dog runs in the building. Sometimes they
Yep.
have things on the rooftop, which means they're also dealing with cleaning it what the building is, which is huge. I mean, like
Yeah.
you probably still have to pick up your dog's poop and whatnot, but like, you know, if it's artificial grass, hosing it off, things that just nobody really wants to do, but as a pet owner, like you do those things because because you have to. So I
Yeah.
think that that's been a massive value add to some of these
Yeah.
apartment buildings.
Yeah, renters are willing to pay for convenience. And
Mhm.
I think, like, as we were talking about the number of new buildings opening up and apartment buildings popping up everywhere, it really is those points of differentiation
Mhm.
between apartments now. Like, a lot of these, as you pointed out, are luxury buildings. So if somebody's willing and able to pay that much money, what is the difference between this building here and this building around the corner? That's why all these new fancy amenities like Tesla rentals are popping up. So it's definitely an emerging trend.
Yeah, and the trouble I've had with this with advising people is that there are a lot of hidden fees sometimes with all of these things we're talking about. There's an amenity fee. Okay, so let's say that amenity fee is $600. You amortize that over the course of a year, and still, $50 a month, right? So it's not like nothing. So if you
Mm-hmm.
start adding all of these different things up, it's a little bit harder, I think, in apartment buildings to truly understand what your monthly kind of cost is. So that's
Right.
something for people to definitely look into as they're getting wowed by all of these amenities, is like, what is it going to cost and how does that really affect your bottom line?
Yeah, definitely take a beat to do the math on all the rentals you're considering, including those monthly fees. Is there a pet fee? I know there's pet rent in a lot of buildings. So it definitely adds up, and using whether it's Zillow's rent affordability calculator, there's a bunch of rental affordability calculators out there. Definitely take the time to do that for yourself to make sure you're comfortable with what you're paying every month.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as we're kind of coming to an end, does it tell them what's coming up in the future and what they might want to expect?
Yeah, well, I definitely want to just point out this April or this episode is coming out in the month of April. April is Fair Housing Month, and I know you did mention tips. One thing we hadn't mentioned yet is just making sure as a tenant or if you're a landlord is to make sure that you know your rights and what is out there for you, the resources available to you. On Zillow, we post local legal protections on all of our rental listings where there are local legal protections, DC being one of those areas. For example, a landlord cannot discriminate based on source of income. So how a renter is paying their rent each month. So that is one example. We put out some research today on the fact that renters of color end up paying way more on upfront costs than white renters. For example, renters pay Black and Latinx renters pay typically $50 for application fees compared to $35 for white renters. And in a lot of areas, DC included, application fees are capped at $50, which is a good thing, but it's still a high amount, especially when we see that white renters typically pay $35. And just those costs add up quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I do want to point out that there are ways to save. Zillow has an application product where you can pay a one-time fee and apply to as many listings as possible over the course of 30 days. So that's just a way to save money and something to think about if you are in this scenario where the upfront costs are really adding up.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say just another general tip as we wind down, and I know we've touched on this a bit, is just make sure you are doing your research on everything. And even if you know you're going to rent 2 months down the line, start doing your research on the market you're interested in now. You can look at comparable listings in the area, just know what you are probably likely to pay in the next couple of months. There's a lot of information out there. Zillow has market rental data trends pages where you can narrow it down to the zip code to see what the median rental price is in that area for, all rentals for a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, so on. So there's a lot you can do to prepare yourself before you enter this competitive market.
Yeah.
And Alison, I would say for the future, I think, I'm not an economist or I don't have a crystal ball, but I will say the trends that we're seeing, we don't expect to see another massive run up in rents, which is the good news. It seems like 2023 is shaping out to be a quote unquote normal year for the rentals market. So there will be those seasonal changes. Rents are starting to rise right now, March, April, May, and following the summertime, they'll probably start to dip, cool a bit again. So depending on where you are in your housing journey, if you're willing to pay more now or wait until the fall when prices might cool again, there's something you can do, and I know you'll be successful.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on. I mean, like I said, we've got lots of other stuff we can talk about. I plan on doing an episode down the road about how to be a landlord and what that means. And we start to kind of bleed into some of the things that we mentioned today. So, anyway, I appreciate having you on. Thank you so much. And yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Allison. Bye.